It was late in the afternoon when the light through the blinds in Thomas Markle's modest California home slanted in gold lines across the kitchen table. The room smelled faintly of strong coffee and ink from the printer sitting on the counter, still warm from the documents it had just produced. In the center of the table sat a thick manila envelope, one that, if Thomas's claims were true, contained the kind of information that could topple the carefully cultivated image of his daughter's royal in-laws. He wasn't smiling, not even a flicker of satisfaction. There was no celebration in the air, only a heavy silence that seemed to press down on everything around him. The envelope, he said, contained certified court documents. Not rumors, not gossip, black and white legal proof. For years, Thomas Markle had been a lightning rod in the global fascination surrounding Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. He had been painted as everything from a loving father left behind to a bitter outsider nursing a grudge. His TV interviews often sparked headlines and backlash in equal measure, yet for all the noise, there were still certain things he had kept to himself. He claimed this was one of them, a secret so volatile that, until now, he had decided the cost of speaking it aloud outweighed whatever personal satisfaction it might bring. But something had changed. Something in the years since Meghan's wedding, the fallout, and the Sussex's ongoing crusade against what they called the toxic press had shifted his resolve. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the envelope like it was a coiled snake. "It's not just about me anymore," he said, his voice flat. "This is about the truth." The word truth hung in the air like a dare. In a media environment where perception is currency, the difference between truth and narrative can mean the rise or fall of public empires. And Thomas was claiming he had truth in its most unforgiving form. Paper trails, booking records, court case numbers, sentencing details. The name on those records, he alleged, was not Meghan's. It was her mother's, Doria Ragland. Doria has long been portrayed in the public eye as Meghan's rock, a poised, soft-spoken yoga instructor and social worker who had attended her daughter's wedding with quiet grace, who had been described as private, dignified, and untouchable by scandal. She was the contrast to Thomas's chatty interviews and public disputes. The media rarely dug into her past, not for lack of trying, but perhaps because nothing had ever surfaced. In that void, an image formed, the composed mother from Los Angeles who kept to herself, a woman above reproach. Now Thomas was claiming that this image wasn't just incomplete. It was deliberately built to hide a past that included a criminal conviction. The tension in this revelation lies not just in the alleged crime, but in the choice to hide it. Royals are no strangers to controversy, but they are deeply protective of image. Every handshake, every wardrobe choice, every family connection is scrutinized. A conviction in the past of a royal's close relative wouldn't just be embarrassing. It could be ammunition for critics, fuel for tabloids, and a permanent stain on the narrative the Sussexes have fought to control. If true, this wasn't just a family matter. It was a political one. Thomas claimed the records told a clear story: an arrest, a trial, a sentencing, and a conviction, all under the name of Doria Ragland. He described the documents in detail, the official court seals embossed on each page, the crisp photocopies of what he said was her booking photo, and a case number traceable in the archives of Los Angeles County's public record system. He alleged the charges were serious enough to leave a mark, not something that could be brushed away as a youthful indiscretion. He said these were not rumors scraped from internet forums or pieced together from half-heard whispers. These were, in his words, the kind of papers lawyers pay to keep buried. Why now? That's the question that crackles under the surface. Thomas had been accused before of cashing in on family drama, of using Meghan's name for attention or profit. But in this instance, he seemed almost reluctant. He did not smile when talking about it. He didn't even seem to relish the prospect of proving Meghan wrong in their years-long war of words. Instead, he spoke like someone convinced that the truth, once buried, had grown too large to contain. He hinted that it wasn't just about setting the record straight, but about countering what he viewed as a public image built on selective storytelling. "If you're going to tell the world your truth," he said, "don't leave out the parts you don't like." The stakes of this claim ripple far beyond family loyalty. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry have built their post-royal brand on a mix of philanthropy, advocacy, and personal narrative. Much of their credibility with their global audience rests on relatability and authenticity. If the public came to believe that they had actively concealed a criminal past within their immediate family, it could erode the trust that underpins their influence. And in the unforgiving court of public opinion, perception is often as damaging as proof. This isn't just about a file of documents. It's about the narrative war that has defined Meghan and Harry's public life since 2018. From their wedding watched by billions, to their dramatic departure from royal duties, to their tell-all interviews and Netflix deals, the Sussexes have been engaged in a near-constant battle to control how they are seen. In such a battle, information is a weapon, and Thomas was claiming to have a weapon they couldn't easily disarm. But what does it mean for the man delivering this information? Thomas Markle is no neutral figure. His history with Meghan is complicated, marked by affection, misunderstanding, and public confrontation. He has been accused of selling stories, of leaking private letters, of embarrassing his daughter at critical moments. Yet he insists his motivations now are not about revenge. Whether the public will believe, that is another story. As the coffee cooled in his mug, Thomas spoke about the day he first came into possession of the documents. He wouldn't give precise details, only that they had come from someone who knew where to look and wasn't afraid to share it. He described opening the envelope for the first time and feeling his stomach drop as he scanned the pages. "I knew then," he said, "that one day this was going to come out. I just didn't know it would be me bringing it out." The introduction of these alleged records doesn't just raise questions about Doria Ragland's past. It raises questions about how far the Sussexes would go to protect an image. Would they have told Harry before the wedding? Would the palace have known? In a family that conducts background checks on anyone entering their inner circle, could this have truly been kept from the highest levels of the royal institution? Or is it possible the royals knew and chose silence, calculating that the risk of exposure was less damaging than the fallout of public acknowledgement? The middle of this story is heavy with shadows, unverified claims, official seals, whispered warnings. But Thomas's determination to speak now suggests he believes the shadow is about to lift, whether Meghan and Harry like it or not. And if history has taught us anything about royal scandals, it's that the first person to speak often sets the terms of the conversation. By the end of that day, the envelope still sat unopened on camera. Thomas wasn't ready to display its contents. Not yet. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice low, his words deliberate. "You'll see for yourself," he said. "It's all in there. And when you do, you'll understand why they worked so hard to keep it quiet." The room was silent again, except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Somewhere in that silence hung the questions that would frame everything to come. Was this the truth at last, or just another volley in a family war that has already spilled far beyond the private walls of home? What was in those documents that could make a father choose public exposure over silence? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when the world finally reads them? Thomas Markle had been called many things in the press over the past 5 years: a publicity seeker, a heartbroken father, a man unable to keep family matters private. But in the days leading up to his decision to release what he claimed were Doria Ragland's criminal records, he carried himself with a strangely quiet determination. Those who had spoken to him said he seemed less like someone preparing for another TV interview and more like a man about to cross a line he could never step back over. It wasn't a decision made in a moment of anger, he insisted. It was something he had turned over in his mind for months, maybe even years, waiting for the point when the balance tipped from keeping silent to speaking out. His life since Meghan's wedding had been a seesaw of sudden public attention and personal isolation. Once a respected television lighting director who worked on popular shows in the late 1980s and 90s, Thomas had enjoyed a life away from tabloid cameras. Then came Meghan's romance with Prince Harry, and everything changed. Invitations were extended to a royal wedding watched by millions. Yet weeks before that day, a series of paparazzi photographs, private letters, and canceled appearances painted him as the estranged father who couldn't be trusted. His absence from the wedding, due to what he described as health problems, cemented an image that he has never been able to escape. But beneath all of that, the staged photo scandal, the interviews, the accusations, Thomas claimed there had been something else, something he had deliberately kept under wraps. He said he had known about Doria's alleged run-in with the law for a long time. He told a small circle of people over the years, but always in hushed tones and without any evidence to back it up. In his mind, speaking about it publicly would have been crossing a boundary he wasn't ready to cross. It would shift the family's fractured relationship into open warfare. For a time, he convinced himself it wasn't worth it. So what changed? According to Thomas, it was the repeated public framing of him as the unreliable party, the man who couldn't be trusted to tell the truth. Meghan and Harry's public statements, whether in interviews, documentaries, or speeches, often painted a picture of a father whose betrayal justified permanent estrangement. Friends say he began to feel that staying silent about certain truths was not protecting anyone anymore. Instead, he felt it allowed what he considered a false narrative to harden. The decision, he said, came one quiet morning when he was reviewing a clip from Meghan's interview with Oprah Winfrey. In it, Meghan had spoken about trust, about protecting loved ones from harmful lies, and about choosing her own truth. The words stuck in his mind. To Thomas, "Your truth" sounded like a selective truth, and that thought gnawed at him. He began to think about the documents he had in his possession, documents with signatures, dates, and the embossed seals of an official record. He asked himself if keeping them locked away was really the moral choice. His small home became a place of constant pacing and late-night phone calls. He spoke to a few people he trusted, weighing their advice. One told him to let it go, that the public wouldn't care, or that it would only make him look vengeful. Another argued that the truth has its own weight, and once known, it can't be ignored. It was the second opinion that lingered. He began to revisit the documents, reading and rereading them, making sure he understood every line. Thomas was careful to point out that going public wasn't as simple as handing the papers to a tabloid. In the age of online misinformation, even real documents can be dismissed as forgeries if not properly verified. He understood that if he released the records, they would need to be authenticated, cross-checked against public archives, and examined by experts in criminal justice documentation. He also knew Meghan and Harry's legal team would respond aggressively, possibly challenging every detail, possibly even accusing him of fabricating the evidence. It wasn't just legal risks he had to consider. There was the personal cost. Speaking about Doria in this way would almost certainly ensure that his already broken relationship with Meghan would be beyond repair. The thought of never reconciling, of never meeting his grandchildren, of being forever branded as the man who dragged Meghan's mother's name into scandal. These were not light considerations. Yet, according to Thomas, it was precisely the lack of any reconciliation that freed him to move forward. "You can't lose what's already gone," he said flatly. Still, he was strategic. Rather than throwing the documents into the public without context, he decided the story needed framing. People had to understand why he was bringing this out now, and what it meant beyond the headline. He wanted the release to be part of a broader conversation about honesty in public life, about how powerful families, whether royal or Hollywood, often erase the uncomfortable parts of their histories to protect an image. "It's not about hurting her," he said. "It's about stopping the lie." In the weeks before making his decision final, Thomas kept the envelope in a locked drawer. Every so often, he would take it out, run his hand over the seal, and set it back without opening it. It was almost as if he was reminding himself that it was real, that he wasn't imagining the gravity of what he had. Friends who visited noticed the change in his demeanor. He was quieter, more deliberate. Gone was the bluster of a man eager for a soundbite. In its place was the slow, deliberate preparation of someone who knew he was about to alter the conversation forever. He also anticipated the counterattack. He knew that as soon as the story broke, there would be questions about his motives, about the timing, about whether he had doctored the documents. He expected Meghan's supporters to dismiss it as another stunt, and her critics to seize on it without hesitation. In the chaotic swirl of online discourse, he understood the truth could be buried under the noise if he wasn't careful. That's why, he said, he was working to ensure that when the documents surfaced, they would be accompanied by expert verification and contextual explanation. There was also the matter of protecting his source. Thomas would not name the person who had provided him with the records, only saying they were someone who knew where to find them and had no loyalty to Meghan or me. The lack of a named source would undoubtedly become part of the controversy, but he was prepared for that too. People will believe what they want to believe, he said, but the paper doesn't lie. As the day of the release drew closer, Thomas began to rehearse in his mind the moment it would all go public. He pictured the headlines, the media debates, the inevitable reaction from Meghan and Harry. He imagined the ripple effects, not just on his family, but on the royal family's media strategy, on public opinion, on the conversations around privacy and transparency. The more he thought about it, the more he felt it was inevitable. Secrets don't stay secrets, he said. They just wait. By the time the decision was final, there was a strange calm in him. The pacing stopped. The phone calls grew shorter. He no longer sought advice. In his mind, the choice had been made, and all that remained was to follow through. It was no longer a question of whether to speak, but how. The envelope wasn't just paper and glue. To Thomas Markle, it felt like the weight of an entire history pressed flat and sealed shut. It had been sitting in the same drawer in his living room for months, its edges slightly softened from being handled, turned over, and studied in silence. When he picked it up, it bent slightly in his hands, thick enough that you could feel the layered contents inside. This wasn't a single sheet. It was a stack, maybe a dozen pages, possibly more, each carrying words that, if true, could ignite an international firestorm. The manila color had darkened slightly over time, the kind of aging that comes from being kept in a place where sunlight occasionally finds it. Thomas didn't keep it hidden out of fear someone would steal it. He kept it hidden because even he knew the moment its contents saw daylight, they could not be unseen. There was no undoing that kind of reveal. The media would run with it, dissect every detail, debate the implications for weeks, maybe months. Lawyers would comb over the language of each line, searching for anything to discredit. And Meghan, he didn't finish the thought. The relationship between them was already shattered, but this would burn what little remained to ash. He first came into possession of the envelope under circumstances he has always described as deliberate but discreet. He would not name the person who handed it to him, only that it was someone with access to records that the average person would never stumble upon. This was no casual favor. The source had sought him out, claiming to have information that might explain why certain stories never saw the light of day. At first, Thomas thought it was another tip built on rumor. He had heard enough wild claims over the years to know most of them collapse under the weight of scrutiny. But this time was different. The person didn't hand him a note, a printout, or a link to some questionable website. They handed him an official packet, complete with embossed seals, printed signatures, and barcodes, the unmistakable language of a government archive. When Thomas slid the documents out for the first time, the first thing that struck him wasn't the text but the photograph clipped to the front. It was a booking photo. The eyes staring back at him were instantly recognizable, though younger. The expression was hard to read, somewhere between resignation and quiet defiance. The caption below it contained a date, a case number, and a name, Doria Ragland. His hands tightened on the edges of the paper. The rest of the packet detailed what appeared to be the entire chain of events. Arrest report, formal charges, court appearance records, sentencing details. Each page had its own official stamp, some in black ink, others in red. Thomas sat there for a long time that day, reading line after line. The text was clinical, matter-of-fact, stripped of any emotion. It didn't care about family dynamics or reputations. It simply recorded actions, times, and consequences. That, he thought, was the thing about official documents. They don't tell you how to feel. They tell you what happened, at least in the eyes of the law. And if these records were genuine, they told a story no one in Meghan's public life had ever heard. It wasn't just the content that made the envelope so potent. It was the clarity. There was no vague language, no alleged or according to sources, just dates, charges, and outcomes. In an age where celebrity rumors travel faster than truth, such tangible proof was rare. It was also dangerous. Thomas knew that the second these pages entered the public domain, there would be two simultaneous battles, one over the facts themselves, and another over the morality of exposing them. For weeks after receiving the packet, he did little with it beyond occasionally revisiting its contents. He'd sit at his kitchen table, the afternoon light cutting across the surface, and methodically reread the documents. Sometimes he would stop at the booking photo, his mind wandering to memories of the Doria he had known decades earlier. They had once been close, bound together by the daughter they shared. Whatever had happened between them over the years, this new knowledge reframed it all. It made him wonder how much of their past had been shaped by unspoken truths. The physicality of the envelope gave it an almost symbolic presence in his home. It was not stored in a folder or file cabinet. It was always in its own space, separate from bills or personal papers. Visitors who saw it on the table might have assumed it was just another stack of old mail. They would never guess it contained something that could rattle not just his family, but the image of the Sussexes themselves. Thomas often imagined the moment of opening it for someone else, perhaps a journalist, perhaps a lawyer. He pictured sliding the papers out, laying them flat, and watching their eyes move over the lines. He knew that initial reaction would be the most telling. You can't fake the first hit of shock, the split-second calculation of what this information could mean. And in his mind, every person who saw it would have to ask the same question. How had this stayed hidden for so long? Part of the answer, he believed, was simple. Few people had reason to go looking. Doria Ragland's public persona was one of quiet dignity. She had kept a low profile through Meghan's rise to fame, speaking rarely and appearing only at key moments. The wedding, the christening, a handful of public charity appearances. In contrast to Thomas's contentious media presence, Doria was the picture of restraint. The press had no scandal to feed on, no odd quotes to amplify. Without suspicion, there was no hunt. Without a hunt, there was no discovery. But Thomas suspected another layer to the secrecy, one involving resources, influence, and the careful management of public records. While criminal records are public in theory, in practice they can be made harder to find, buried under bureaucracy, or obscured by legal maneuvers. He didn't claim to know exactly how Doria's history had been kept from public view, but he was convinced it had been intentional. You don't go decades without a single leak in the celebrity news cycle unless someone is actively plugging the holes. The longer he kept the envelope in his possession, the more it seemed to take on a life of its own. It was both a burden and a shield. In his darker moments, he considered it his insurance, not in the sense of blackmail, but as a way to prove, if ever pushed to the wall, that he wasn't the only one in the family with a complicated past. At other times, it felt like a ticking clock. Sooner or later, someone else might find the same records, and if they did, Thomas would lose the ability to shape the story. He noticed how the thought of the envelope began to shape his conversations. Even when talking about unrelated topics, he'd find his mind circling back to it. Friends who knew about it, the very few he had confided in, would ask cautiously if he planned to use it. Some advised caution, warning that once the information was public, it could never be pulled back. Others encouraged him, arguing that keeping it secret made him complicit in maintaining a false image. Every opinion added weight to his own internal debate. Sometimes, late at night, he would take the envelope out and lay it on the table without opening it, just to feel its presence. The sound of the manila paper sliding across the wood was sharp in the quiet room. He'd place his fingertips on it, thinking about the journey those documents had taken, from a court clerk's archive, to a confidential source, to his home. There was a chain of custody here, and he was now a critical link in it. He also thought about how the envelope might be received by different audiences. To Meghan's staunch supporters, it might be dismissed as a desperate smear. To her critics, it could be seized upon as proof of hypocrisy. To the royal family, it might be an inconvenient reminder of how little control they had over the private histories of those who marry into the fold. And to the broader public, it would likely be one more twist in a saga that had already blurred the lines between family drama and international intrigue. The envelope was no longer just paper. It was a loaded artifact, a potential pivot point in a story that had already consumed years of his life. And in the end, Thomas knew one thing for certain. It would not stay sealed forever. Whether by his hand or someone else's, it would be opened. The only question was when, and on whose terms. Before she became the serene, soft-spoken figure at Meghan Markle's wedding, before the quiet smiles at charity events, and long before her name was spoken in the same breath as the royal family, Doria Ragland had been someone else entirely. The woman the world saw in wide-brimmed hats and elegant dresses was the end product of decades of reinvention. What Thomas Markle claimed to have in that envelope wasn't just a record of a single mistake. It was, in his view, a missing piece of the puzzle that explained why certain chapters of Doria's past were never discussed, even in casual family conversation. In the Los Angeles of the late 1970s and early 1980s, Doria was not yet defined by motherhood or royal connections. She was a young woman navigating a city that could be as predatory as it was full of opportunity. She came from a working-class background, with roots in the African-American community of Southern California. Jobs came and went, a stint as a temp in an office, a few months as a travel agent, occasional part-time work in fashion retail. Like many in their 20s, she seemed to be searching for a place to plant her feet. It was in those years, Thomas recalled, that Doria's life moved in circles he would later realize were more complicated than they seemed. She had friends in both artistic and streetwise communities, people who lived on the fringes of legality, mixing the glamour of nightlife with the grit of surviving in a competitive, often unforgiving city. Los Angeles was in the throes of an economic and cultural shift. Booming in entertainment, struggling in blue-collar sectors, and plagued by crime in certain neighborhoods. For young people without a strong safety net, the temptation to take shortcuts was always there. Thomas claimed that Doria's alleged arrest came in the midst of this uncertain period. He didn't claim she was a hardened criminal or part of an organized scheme, but according to the court documents he described, she had been in the wrong place, with the wrong people, making the wrong decisions at exactly the wrong time. The charge itself, he would later say, wasn't minor. It carried enough weight that, if convicted, it would remain on a permanent record. It wasn't the kind of thing you could explain away as a traffic ticket or a misunderstanding. In the official account, there was no dramatic police chase, no breaking headlines. The arrest was the kind of quiet, procedural operation that happens every day in a city that large. An officer writes up a report, logs the evidence, and the individual is taken to a holding facility. What made it notable, Thomas said, was that it was attached to Doria's name, a name that, decades later, would be linked to Buckingham Palace. After the arrest, according to the documents, Doria faced the standard steps: booking, fingerprinting, and a bail hearing. This wasn't speculation. Thomas said the dates and locations were clearly printed in the record. Her mugshot, a younger version of the woman the public knew, was clipped to the report. The eyes were familiar, but the context was jarring. The trial or hearing that followed was not splashed across newspapers at the time. It played out quietly, possibly because no one thought it would be of interest outside a small circle. Los Angeles courts processed thousands of cases a year, and Doria's would have been one of many. Yet, in retrospect, the details, if made public during Meghan's rise, would have been explosive. Thomas believed that this was why the story never made it beyond official files. In his telling, Doria served her sentence quietly and moved on. The nature of that sentence, he said, was spelled out clearly: a set period of time under supervision, fines, and conditions that had to be met to avoid further consequences. There was no attempt in the document to paint her as a victim of circumstance. The language was straightforward and, at times, cold. What struck Thomas the most, he said, was how completely Doria appeared to have rebuilt her life afterward. By the time Meghan was a child, there was no sign of that earlier trouble. She worked as a yoga instructor, trained as a social worker, and became known among her peers as grounded and compassionate. It was, in Thomas's view, a remarkable reinvention, but one that came with a cost: the erasure of a chapter she didn't want anyone to revisit. He recalled moments during their marriage when he sensed there were things she preferred not to talk about. If the conversation drifted toward her younger years, she would redirect or go quiet. At the time, Thomas assumed it was simply a matter of personality. Some people just don't like to dwell on the past. But now, with the documents in hand, he wondered whether those silences had been intentional shields. Los Angeles in those days had an unspoken code. If you wanted to change your life, you didn't bring your past into your present. You didn't hand out old stories like souvenirs. You left them where they were and hoped no one came looking. That code worked well enough, until you became connected to one of the most famous families in the world. Thomas was convinced that Meghan knew something of her mother's past, though perhaps not every detail. He based this on small things: the way Meghan fiercely protected Doria's public image, the absence of any extended interviews with her mother in the years after joining the royal family, the careful choice of language when discussing her upbringing. Meghan spoke often about her mother's strength and independence, but never gave much away about her younger life. The alleged conviction, if proven genuine, wouldn't make Doria unique. Plenty of people have blemishes on their record and go on to lead respectable lives. What made this different, Thomas believed, was the deliberate effort to bury it entirely, to present an image that erased the existence of that time. In the world of celebrity and royalty, he argued, image is currency. And in his mind, the value of Meghan and Harry's brand relied in part on keeping Doria untouched by scandal. As Thomas told it, Doria's hidden chapter wasn't just a personal secret. It was a controlled omission from a narrative sold to the public. He saw parallels in the way certain Hollywood figures manage their backstories, omitting inconvenient truths to maintain a spotless image. But this was bigger because it involved a royal connection. The idea that the monarchy could be linked, even indirectly, to a criminal conviction was the kind of headline British tabloids dream about. There was also the question of how Doria's past had stayed completely off the radar for so long. Thomas speculated that it might have been due to the timing. The arrest happening decades before Meghan's fame meant there was no immediate reason for journalists to dig deep into her mother's history. And once Meghan became famous, the absence of prior coverage may have discouraged further searching. In a way, the silence fed itself. No one reported it, so everyone assumed there was nothing to find. But Thomas didn't assume that anymore. With the envelope in his possession, he saw the gap in the public record as proof of how selective storytelling works. He spoke about it as though lifting a curtain, not to destroy a life, but to show what was behind the stagecraft. For him, this hidden chapter was central to understanding why Meghan and Harry's narrative had been so fiercely guarded. In a media landscape where one damaging revelation can dominate headlines for weeks, the existence of something like this, left undisclosed, meant that every public statement about transparency and truth came with an asterisk. The documents, he believed, were not just about Doria. They were about the power of omission, the calculated curation of identity, and the consequences when those omissions are exposed. In his mind, once the public saw the record, they would have to reevaluate not only what they thought they knew about Doria Ragland, but about the family dynamic that had played out on the world stage. And as far as Thomas was concerned, that reevaluation was long overdue. The arrest itself, as described in the documents Thomas claimed to hold, was not a cinematic spectacle. There were no flashing lights tearing down a boulevard, no swarming media waiting at the courthouse steps. It was the kind of moment that happens quietly and without fanfare, the kind that most people involved hope will disappear into obscurity. But for Doria Ragland, it marked the point where an ordinary life intersected with the cold machinery of the law. The absence of a prison term was significant. It meant that while the conviction was real and lasting, she would be able to serve her sentence while continuing to work and live in the community. To Thomas, this was a sign that the court viewed her as someone who could be rehabilitated without full incarceration. But it also meant that her freedom came with strings, conditions that, if violated, could send her straight to jail. In the official documents, the sentencing section was laid out in clean, legal language. There were no personal comments, no moral judgments. Just the facts, the charge, the sentence, the conditions. But to anyone reading between the lines, it was clear this was a pivotal moment. The conviction would follow her for the rest of her life, appearing in background checks, legal databases, and court archives. Thomas imagined what it must have felt like for her to walk out of the courthouse that day. The sun would have been the same, the streets just as noisy, but everything in her life had shifted. She would now carry a label that could close doors, limit opportunities, and shadow her interactions. Even if she never spoke of it, especially if she never spoke of it, the knowledge would remain, tucked away in the quiet corners of her mind. Over the next months, according to the probation records Thomas claimed to have reviewed, Doria complied with the court's orders. She met her probation officer, completed her community service, and attended the required program sessions. There were no recorded violations, no further incidents. If anything, she appeared determined to put the matter behind her as quickly and cleanly as possible. By the time her probation ended, she had satisfied all the conditions set out by the court. This was the part of the story that Thomas found most telling. She didn't fight the system endlessly or try to evade her responsibilities. She did what was required and moved on, but moved on in a way that seemed to involve erasing the incident from her public identity. There were no references to it in conversation, no hints in her professional life. As far as the outside world was concerned, it had never happened. To Thomas, this was both understandable and revealing. Understandable because few people would want to keep such an event in the spotlight. Revealing because the deliberate silence suggested a desire not just to move on, but to rewrite the narrative entirely. And when Meghan's life began intersecting with Hollywood and eventually the royal family, that rewritten narrative became the only one presented to the world. In the years that followed, the conviction lay dormant in official archives. The file was there, accessible to those who knew exactly where and how to look, but it was buried under layers of bureaucracy and the sheer volume of cases processed by the county. It wasn't the kind of record that would surface in casual searches or gossip columns. It required effort to find, the kind of effort, Thomas said, that someone with motivation and resources could make sure was never undertaken. The legal finality of the conviction didn't erase the human impact. For someone entering the royal sphere decades later, even a long-past offense could be a liability. The British royal family's vetting process for spouses is thorough, but it also relies on the assumption that any concerning information will be volunteered or at least not aggressively hidden. Whether the palace ever knew about Doria's record is an open question, one that Thomas has speculated about often. If they did know, they chose not to address it publicly. If they didn't, then they were kept in the dark about a fact that could have been considered relevant. Thomas viewed the conviction as the central piece of the envelope in his possession. The arrest was the spark, the courtroom drama the conflict, but the conviction was the resolution, the part that transformed the entire episode from allegation to legal truth. And in his mind, that truth was powerful enough to challenge the image that Meghan and Harry had carefully constructed around their family. The sentence itself, modest compared to what it could have been, was not what made it damaging in the present day. It was the existence of the conviction at all, the simple fact that it could be cited, verified, and proven. In a world where public figures can often dismiss accusations as baseless or politically motivated, a certified court record carries a weight that opinion cannot easily counter. For years, Doria lived with that reality privately, building a new life, taking on new roles, and eventually stepping into a position of global visibility as the mother of a duchess. She carried herself with dignity, never hinting at the chapter Thomas now claimed to have documented. And perhaps, Thomas thought, she might have succeeded in keeping it hidden forever, if not for the envelope in his drawer. In the end, the conviction and sentence were more than legal milestones. They were a quiet dividing line in Doria's life, marking the point before which she was simply another young woman in Los Angeles and after which she became someone who had learned how dangerous exposure could be. That awareness, Thomas believed, shaped everything that came after, including the decision to keep her history sealed off from the world. The question of whether Meghan Markle knew about her mother's conviction was, in Thomas Markle's mind, not a matter of if, but when. Did she learn about it as a teenager, perhaps through overheard conversations or subtle hints? Or did the truth arrive later, when her world began expanding beyond Los Angeles and into circles where background checks were a matter of protocol? Thomas believed the answer lay somewhere between those 2 points. Growing up, Meghan's relationship with Doria was close but carefully curated. Doria was the parent who introduced her to cultural events, who encouraged her independence, who spoke openly about race and identity. But when it came to certain personal histories, there was a noticeable absence. Meghan's friends from childhood often described Doria as warm but reserved, someone who could be in the room with you while keeping large parts of herself elsewhere. In Thomas's telling, that reserve was no accident. He had noticed it during their own marriage, long before Meghan was old enough to understand. Doria could talk for hours about art, music, and social issues, but she navigated around certain topics with the skill of someone who had been practicing for years. Questions about her early 20s, her friend groups during that time, or certain gaps in her employment history were met with vague replies. Thomas, at the time, accepted it as personality. But later, with the documents in hand, those gaps took on a new shape. If Meghan did know about her mother's past, Thomas wondered how it might have influenced her choices. As a young actress trying to establish herself in Hollywood, Meghan would have been acutely aware of how fragile image could be. Casting directors, agents, and publicists live on perceptions, and any detail that could complicate a marketable narrative is treated like a loose thread that must be cut away. It would not have been difficult for Meghan to understand that her mother's conviction, even decades old, was something to be kept firmly in the shadows. There were moments, Thomas recalled, when Meghan's protectiveness of Doria seemed unusually intense. In public interviews, Meghan rarely spoke about her mother in detail beyond affirming her strength and grace. She described her as a yoga instructor and social worker, but never expanded on what came before those roles. Even in the most high-profile moments, the engagement interview with Harry, the wedding coverage, Doria was presented as an elegant mystery. There were no deep dives into her past, no school friends brought forward, no extended family interviews. For Thomas, this was telling. In the media frenzy surrounding Meghan's entrance into the royal family, nearly every aspect of her life had been dissected. Childhood photos, school yearbooks, former colleagues, all found their way into print. But Doria's younger years remained untouched, as though an invisible barrier surrounded them. Journalists who tried to investigate seemed to find nothing concrete. To Thomas, this was either an extraordinary coincidence or the result of deliberate control. When Meghan and Harry began speaking about their truth in interviews, Thomas found himself thinking about the envelope in his drawer. Meghan framed her narrative as one of resilience, of overcoming personal and systemic challenges. In that framing, Doria was the anchor, the constant presence of moral clarity. If the public learned that Doria had once been convicted of a criminal offense, Thomas believed it would challenge the foundation of that story. It would not erase Meghan's achievements, but it would force people to reevaluate how much of her public identity was built on omission. Thomas also considered the possibility that Meghan had learned about the conviction only in adulthood, perhaps during the process of royal vetting. The British royal family is known for conducting thorough background checks on anyone entering the line of succession through marriage. Such checks extend to close family members. If Doria's record was still accessible in certain databases, it is possible that palace officials discovered it and quietly informed Meghan. In that scenario, Meghan's public silence would have been part of a mutual understanding with the royal institution, a decision to bury the fact to avoid scandal. If this were the case, Thomas speculated, it might also explain the palace's otherwise hands-off approach to Doria. Unlike other in-laws who became embroiled in minor controversies, Doria was never the target of public correction or quiet distancing. She was presented without complication, given the royal seal of acceptance without visible hesitation. This could have been genuine goodwill, or it could have been a calculated move to protect the family's image by ensuring no one looked too closely. There were other signs, subtle but suggestive. Meghan's own career trajectory showed an understanding of narrative control long before she met Harry. In interviews, she often spoke about crafting her own brand, about being intentional in what she shared. When she launched her lifestyle blog, The Tig, she curated its content meticulously, leaving out anything that might invite unwelcome questions. Thomas could not recall a single instance where Meghan wrote or spoke publicly about her mother's early life beyond broad, flattering strokes. In private conversations, Meghan's approach was similar. Thomas remembered times when he had started to bring up family stories in front of her friends or colleagues, only for her to gently redirect the conversation. He had once chalked it up to her not wanting him to embarrass her with fatherly anecdotes. Now, he wondered if she had been guarding more than her own privacy. If Meghan had known for years, it meant she had carried the secret into her marriage, her public life, and her global platform. If she had only found out later, it meant she had adapted quickly, building walls around the information with the same precision she applied to other aspects of her image. Either way, Thomas believed the result was the same. An unspoken agreement between mother and daughter that this chapter of Doria's life would remain invisible. For Thomas, the ethical question was unavoidable. Is omission the same as deception? Meghan and Harry have often criticized the press for distorting the truth, for leaving out crucial context that changes the meaning of a story. But if they themselves had chosen to omit a significant fact from their own narrative, was that not the same tactic they condemned? To the public, Meghan's knowledge of her mother's conviction might not change the affection or admiration they feel for her. But in the high-stakes world of royal and celebrity branding, perception is currency. A carefully maintained image of moral authority could be dented by the revelation that a key piece of personal history was deliberately kept out of sight. Thomas knew that if the documents in his possession were ever released, one of the first questions asked would be, when did Meghan know? The answer could determine how the story was received. If she had known all along, critics would frame it as a calculated deception. If she had only learned later, defenders could argue that she was simply protecting her mother's privacy. In either case, the narrative would shift. In his mind, this was one of the reasons the envelope was so powerful. It wasn't just the contents, it was the implications. A conviction from decades ago might be survivable in the public arena, but the suggestion of long-term concealment, especially in a family already accused of controlling the media narrative, could have a far greater impact. And so, the question lingered in the air, unanswered but heavy. Did Meghan know, and for how long? Thomas believed the truth would eventually surface. The only uncertainty was whether it would come from his envelope or from someone else's.